Cool, cool. So we're doing Walking by Thoreau, which is an essay that I believe was originally a lecture. He originally delivered this lecture, I think in 1951, I was reading, and then later kind of took bits and pieces from that and turned it into what it is today, this piece, Walking. And I got to say, when we first kind of discussed doing it, I was kind of like a little scared that there wasn't going to be enough meat on the bone. I was kind of like, are we really going to be able to, have a conversation about walking? But he definitely packs a lot in here. He kind of uses walking as like a jumping off point.
Yeah, it's definitely a bit disorganized, I think, and kind of rambly, but I think that I didn't really like that so much, but then at the same time, I feel, that is more of in the spirit of the kinds of walks that he likes to pursue, and he sort of like goes hither and yon, and then eventually comes back to, tying in a few key words at the end that are the same at the beginning, so. Yeah,
I thought the same thing when I was reading it. There's a kind of like meta thing happening where in the piece he talks about, the adventurous spirit that a walker needs to have, and that somebody who is walking should just kind of go where their feet take them and kind of wander and saunter around. And the meta thing is that it's the kind of style of this piece is written in, where he starts talking about walking, and then that kind of leads him into talking about something else, which leads him to talk about something else. And then eventually, he ends the piece talking about walking. So the piece itself is a bit like a walk around.
Yeah. And would you say it is a good walk or not so good?
I mean, I enjoyed the walk. I kind of enjoyed where some of the places that he takes us. I mean, he takes us into talking about education, like names of people, a lot about nature, some stuff about mythology. It was really cool. It kind of reminded me of some of Montaigne's essays, except I feel like Montaigne will just kind of like take you out to left field and then just like leave you there and just be like, I'm done writing. Whereas Thoreau
like
kind of
out in this field tonight.
Exactly. Whereas Thoreau at least kind of like brings you back home eventually.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a sort of side thought about Thoreau that I was having. Not entirely, someone will have to fact check me on this, but I wonder about, so he talks a lot about his style of walking, that he will go 10 miles in a day or something every afternoon. Mm-hmm. He's not sure which direction he is going to go from at the start. He doesn't take roads. He just sort of wanders about, and then he circles back at the end of the day. And I kind of wonder if the spirit of adventure that he boasts of and celebrates is actually in the kind of walk that he takes. Because it seems to me that there's like several kinds of walking. One is where you just walk along the road and then you have a very set destination. You go from point A to point B and then you're back again.
Right.
Which he says, this is not really walking. Maybe this is walking for exercise or something.
Right.
And then he says, true walking is a kind of sauntering about. You're not sure where you're going, but then he always loops back to home base. And I just wonder if that returning is actually sort of against the principles of sort of sauntering, voyaging that he is excited about, right? Because you'd think, true throwing caution to the wind would be just going out, and then I'm not sure where I
well,
wind
yeah,
up.
right. You're following wherever your feet kind of lead you. So yeah, I think that's a good question because, yeah, he is saying, this, the way I kind of read this is that the spirit of walking to him it's kind of a mindset. It's this kind of open mindset, the kind of adventurer mindset of like, I don't have any goal or destination. I'm not really like trying to get anywhere or do anything. I'm just kind of following my feet, going into the world and kind of being led by, my instinct or soul or intuition, kind of whatever we want to fill in that blank. But yeah, you're right, because he says he'll go on these kind of walks for like 4 hours a day, which, by the way, I mean,
that's a lot.
Like, that's a lot of time. And he says like, yeah, he's like, I need to go out for 4 hours a day. And if I don't, then like, I just feel horrible.
Yeah.
But anyway, so he says he does that every day, but you're right. He does, as far as we know, always wind up back at home. Which, if he was kind of truly in this spirit, like, I don't know, maybe he would, get on a ship that was like leaving port and like wind up in South America.
Yeah.
And he does say, there's a quote I really liked about this kind of adventurer's spirit. That kind of captures this. He says, "We should go forth on the shortest walk, perchance, in the spirit of undying adventure, never to return, prepared to send back our embalmed hearts only as relics to our desolate kingdoms. If you are ready to leave father and mother and brother and sister and wife and child and friends and never see them again, if you have paid your debts and made your will and settled all your affairs and are a free man, then you are ready for a walk."
Yeah, that's like a real build-up.
Yeah, right. So that is the kind of mindset, I think, in Thoreau's opinion, we should be in anytime we go out for a walk, is to just maybe, I guess, somewhere in the back of our minds, we'll know that, okay, I am going to kind of come home in a couple of hours because like, I have a job and responsibilities, but I am kind of going into the world as if I am untethered and I'm just kind of open to whatever experience or things that I come across. Yeah.
So I guess I don't mean to be all down on Thoreau right out of the gate.
No,
I mean,
it's all right.
Generally, I do enjoy reading Thoreau a lot, but it makes me think about too, when he was writing Walden, right? Which is very celebrated for this solitudinous life, living, roughing it. You're participating in nature fully. And he was just like, wasn't he living on Emerson's farm or like one of his friends' farm, like really close to everything? Yeah. Like if I drove 30 minutes out of the city and I was, somewhere, and I was like, ooh, look at me. I'm very much in the wild now. But then like I run to Kmart or whatever, or the gas station,
Right. Well, yeah, he was on Emerson State, I believe. So he wasn't like in the deep woods of Montana, like cut off from civilization. Yeah. But as far as I know, he wasn't kind of like cheating and like going into town every now and then. I think he kind of stayed on his own.
We'll have to look that up, because I totally thought he was, but I could be wrong.
Oh, yeah.
But the thing that I think about is that, in a sense, there's like this praise of this kind of virtue or way of living. And Thoreau is considered like a transcendentalist. So he's really saying like, you really got to, shove off out of society. You have to be your own person. But then he always kind of has a little safety net, like he always comes home at the end of his walk, or his like wooded estate really is just, being on Emerson's thing. And yeah, I kind of wonder, I mean, obviously he wouldn't have been the writer that he was if he actually went and lived that way. I think you'd like, what is the guy's name in Into the Wild who goes and does that? Alexander Supertramp.
Yeah.
And he just goes out, he seems to be very much in the spirit of this kind of walk, but he's, goes 100%.
That is true. That maybe Emerson in his actual life maybe didn't always follow his own advice or
Thoreau.
I said Emerson, I meant Thoreau. Yeah, that he maybe that the character from, or the historical guy from Into the Wild maybe embodies this a little bit more. Was like a true vagabond, and really did just kind of go wherever the world kind of took him, and kind of was a true leaf blowing in the wind. But I think nonetheless, I think what he's capturing here is like, it's a way of interacting with the world that is, at least for me, very different than how I typically interact with the world, which is, I've kind of been thinking about this over the week since I read this. I think me, and I think a lot of people also, we're kind of existing in this like kind of checklist mindset of like, I have these things that I need to get done, or these goals that I'm trying to accomplish. So I'm kind of like going out and trying to do them, kind of trying to tick them off. And this kind of orientation is kind of the opposite of that. This is kind of like going out without any agenda and just like being open to whatever happens to you. And I think what's interesting is like something like vacation, like you can see, it's very interesting how different people vacation, because you have some people who, when they're on vacation, they go into this very open mindset. They're like, I just want to go to, Rome, and then just like walk around, kind of see where Rome takes me. If I feel like I want to come over here and get some wine, then I'll do that. And then other people, when they vacation, it's very much just like, I have these 10 things that I want to do today, and I'm going to like check them off one at a time and go ding, ding, ding. So yeah, I don't know. It's, I think it's just like a different, it's an orientation. It's not really the distinction between like vacation and work day, because like I said, you can still be on vacation and not have this kind of like walker, adventurer orientation. Yeah.
So I'm curious about this. So do you feel like you're going to change anything about how you live based off of this idea that Thoreau talks about, which again is sort of walking without an end goal in sight? Like kind of, there are all these structures that we use to frame both our physical lives when we're going about from place to place, right? But also, I think, as you kind of talk about, our internal lives and the patterns of thought that we have, or the way that we approach a day by saying, okay, I've got, 10 things I need to do. And he sort of says, don't do any of that. Like, you really have to just be free, live in the present, go about. So if you think that you would include some of that in your life, like how are you aiming at incorporating that?
Sure. Well, so I know personally, I tend to be more of the kind of planner and like, have goals and agendas, but some things that I've done in the past, there was a kind of exercise in this book I read called The Artist Way. It's called Artist Dates. And like once a week, you would just kind of like basically take yourself on a date. And so I did this for years. And every week I would like either plan out something to do. Like sometimes I'd be like, okay, I'm going to go to this museum Or sometimes I just wouldn't plan anything. I would just be like, okay, I'm just going to go to this subway stop and I'm just going to wander. And I really liked that practice a lot and really got into some cool, like weird shit that I don't think I ever would have gotten into. Like visiting Scientology museums and like talking to all kinds of interesting people. And I haven't done it for a while. And actually, after I read this, I did it on Saturday. Like I was in Manhattan and I just like put the book down just for like a couple of hours, just kind of wandered and just, didn't have any set destination or any goal in mind. Just kind of, followed wherever my feet kind of took me.
Yeah.
And
I'm ready for a walk now. Come on, let's do it.
Yeah. But I don't know. So I think there are probably ways to incorporate it into your life in, I think even something like a date, like a good date can be that as well. If both people are on board, that, you show up, maybe you have like a meeting destination and then you show up and you're just like, let's just show up, meet up, and then we just kind of do whatever we want to do. If we feel like getting some wine, we can go there. If we feel like wandering and hearing this jazz band that's playing, like we can do that. But I think both people probably have to be on board. Because if they're not, you can have some tension where a person's just like, but I need structure. Like, what are we doing? Wait, we don't have a plan? Yeah.
I think it's interesting. I mean, I would imagine that one of the reasons why we tend to organize our time or our lives or our cities or whatever in the way that we do is partly out of security, right? I mean, one is efficiency.
Yeah, I was going to say that too, efficiency.
That's totally part of it. But I think, when we're overly efficient, then I think that there's something lost there, which, it's the sort of like the difference between like a car that is manufactured by like the Model T or whatever versus like a car that was handmade by some dude in his shop, right? Or like the difference between something off the rack or bespoke.
Yeah.
And even though you have more ultimately of the product, I think you end up missing something, especially if you are the one building it yourself. If it's like, I'm going to get a cool bookshelf from IKEA versus I'm going to try to build something for this space. We miss out when everything comes with the instruction manual and then you just follow, 1 through 10. And I think it's an experiential kind of missing out. I mean, obviously you save some time, but then maybe that only matters if you're saving that time for something else. But I think usually we don't.
Sure. Well, and just that productivity and creativity don't really come from the same place. So, I think the kind of like checklist mindset of like, I've got these things to get through and tick them off, like that works really well if you're just like in the getting things done mode. But that's not really a good way to orient yourself to do creative work. And I think a lot of what Thoreau is touching on here is that because I think a lot of what he's talking about is kind of the difference between like order and chaos, or we could say instead of order and chaos, we could say like nature and civilization. He's kind of saying that like we need this wildness, this nature to kind of replenish us. It's kind of the thing that keeps everything else fresh. So yeah, I think if you are just constantly in that, checklist mindset of, getting things done, ticking things off, yeah, you're not really living. You're kind of living as like a cog in the machine, but you're not actually engaging in the world and, feeling alive, which, Thoreau talks a lot about. And that, I think, is why he has, such a hard on for nature is this wild spirit that, it's up for debate whether or not he's romanticizing it or not, but he definitely spends a lot of time in here talking about, he says he's basically anything that is wild and kind of unkempt, he prefers to the more domesticated, civilized version. So he says I will take a swamp over a cultivated piece of land. I will take somebody with olive skin over somebody with white skin. And I think he's saying that in terms of somebody whose skin has, has seen the sun, has seen the elements. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know. Did you have any ideas about that?
About what color my skin turns when it sees the
No. just about kind of his thoughts around, because he talks in here a lot about nature and this wildness that he sees lacking in his current society.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just trying to think about how far off the deep end do I want to take this. I think I'm gonna not go super crazy yet, but
well, we can be in the spirit of Thoreau and kind of go where the conversation leads us.
Yeah. So one thing that I was thinking about a little bit during this essay, I was with some friends of mine, and we were talking about what are sacred spaces to us. Where do we feel, if we have a place, what is that place? And I would say a mix of spiritual people to non-spiritual. I don't think anyone was really overtly religious. Maybe there was one person, but nobody said church. Everyone's place was somewhere in nature. Somebody had some woods that they went to. One was a certain ravine kind of close to where I live. And I think that says something to me. I mean, I'm not sure. I don't know if I would have a complete definition about what a spiritual place is, but one thing that it must have is a sense of meaning that can't be easily organized into words or short descriptions. As in, if you go out to the woods, or actually, let me go back. If I was supposed to describe my house to somebody, I could say, okay, it's got all these walls. It has this bookcase. There's a little frame around the doors. I could describe it down to detail, and at the end of it, you would have a sense of what the kind of place is.
Yeah.
Or, you could do that with an Arby's for something even more mundane and less personal. But I think when there's a place that's spiritual, you could probably talk about a certain woods and maybe describe, oh, there's this tree here, there's this tree here. But when you're doing that, you're not actually getting at the meaning of the place itself. And I think even the person who's describing it knows, I'm telling you this and this and this about it, but really, I'm not actually doing the place justice, for example.
Right. And there's an element that cannot be put into words, maybe.
Yeah. And I think that I think for a lot of people, nature is that kind of place, especially because it is more or less inherently unorganized. I mean, certainly there's ways in which, trees grow as compared to the understory or whatever, or the little shrubs, or the way that the wildlife interacts. But it is far more random than anything that most people are comfortable with. I would be curious if people from, thousands of years ago, when civilization was much more primitive, if they would still feel that the natural area is sort of sacred. Is it really that there's something inherent about nature, or is it just the fact that it is totally distinct from what we experience on the day to day, for most people who live in urban areas, who always drive on the road, who walk on the sidewalks, that kind of thing.
Right. I mean, I would tend to think that that it's not, because you're kind of saying, is it just the fact that we're never in nature, so that, when we finally do go there, it feels sacred? Yeah. I would tend to think, no, I would tend to think there is something, and I think Thoreau probably would agree with that, because he said, what's kind of interesting is when he just kind of lets himself walk and lets himself wander, he's always just drawn to nature. Like he's always just kind of like feels pulled to there. Like there's some like magnetic force pulling him to nature. And yeah, I don't know. I think he also at one point says, that like birds have this kind of like instinct to migrate, and that humans might have that similar instinct for walking in the woods. And I think that makes sense evolutionarily as well, because, most of our evolution, we were hunter-gatherers, and we were walking a lot. We were walking a lot in nature. So his kind of, spending 4 hours a day walking today sounds crazy. Today it's just like, who the fuck has that much time? Like, how are you able to just walk in the woods for 4 hours? But like in the grand scheme of human evolution, I don't think that's crazy at all. I think that number is probably low in terms of like how many hours our ancestors probably spent walking.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that personally, I find that there's something very pleasurable about it. I mean, I think when I was growing up, my family, we'd go on walks all the time. This was like our after dinner entertainment, or like the way that just like what we did. And we would walk, maybe it was just like a mile, and it would usually just be up and down the subdivision. I will say Thoreau really celebrates kind of aimless wandering, just without any real direction, unless you count like, deer trails or something like that. I think I am not as comfortable just bushwhacking through, everything, and then hopefully I'll get back to, where I started. But definitely kind of aimless wandering is through the streets where I live, is something that I came to reappreciate after the pandemic started, because there was just less things to do. I think I was walking like 20 miles a week last summer, and just exploring the neighborhood, looking at things in a different way. And I think that there is something very true. One of the things that he talks about is when you're walking, and you might be in roughly the same area as you were before, but you're just a couple steps over this time, and everything looks totally different, which is completely true. I recently reread To Kill a Mockingbird, and at the end of that, the whole story basically takes place in a small town, and a lot of it just along this one street. And the main character, Scout, is looking at everything from her front porch's perspective. Usually when she references something, it's like this person across the street or next door. At the end of the story, she goes down the street, and she is on the porch of another character's house, a porch that she hadn't been to yet. And suddenly she notices that even though it's the same street, everything is completely different. And I think in this story, to go on a slight tangent, it's about growing up and how you see some things as a child, but through the events of the story, she grows up. Now she's over here in this literal other place. But there is a kind of maybe not large scale growing up that goes on when we take walks and we see something in a new light, but it does add another dimension of appreciation and understanding what a thing is, like what this house looks like or what this tree is. And I think that makes it infinitely richer. So taking walks is great. Thank you, COVID, for reminding me of that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it kind of gave us a chance to kind of pause and smell the roses, as it were. And yeah, I mean, I like that there was that passage in here where he says that basically you can take the same walk in like a 10-mile radius your whole life. And if you're in this, mindset, the appropriate walker mindset, you're going to see something different every time. And I think he doesn't really say why, but I would intuit that the things that change are, your path is never going to be exactly the same. Plus, you are never going to be the exact same person, Yeah. It's kind of like when you reread a great book a couple of years later, it's a completely different experience. The text is the same, but you've changed so much. So passages that didn't really strike you the first time around, like really strike you now. And I think it's the same type of thing when you're walking a similar path.
I totally thought you were going to go with the "you can't step in the same river twice" kind of metaphor.
Oh, yeah, no, that is a good metaphor for it.
That would have been the low hanging fruit of the analogies to use there.
Nice. I'm glad we included it then.
Yeah.
But I was going to ask you, so he says he spends a decent amount of time talking about this pull into nature, but he also talks a decent amount about this westward pull, and that if we just kind of wander, we end up wandering westward. And I don't know, I have some thoughts about it. He kind of says, like, when you look at the history of, America and how Columbus was drawn west over the Atlantic, and then after that, the settlers were then drawn further and further west until they reached the Pacific. And he seems to think that there's some inherent westward pull, and that maybe part of it is the sun sets in the west, so it's almost like we're chasing the setting sun. And I think the romantic in me really likes that idea, but I think the skeptic in me is skeptical of that, because I think the first people to migrate, at least the current hypothesis, the out of Africa hypothesis, they all went east. So it was, the first Homo sapiens leaving Africa migrated up north and then went through present day Russia over the, Bering Strait into that land bridge into modern day Alaska, and then down into the Americas. So that was all Eastern. And so I almost am skeptical that maybe this kind of like westward pull that he is referring to has to do with the geography of the world, in that there was this big ass Atlantic Ocean keeping people from going west until they had the tools and ships to do it. And that is kind of what this westward pull is. But I don't know. What did you think about his westward pull?
Oh yeah, I think it's ridiculous. I mean, for a couple of things. I mean, first of all, when he's saying he personally is always drawn west, I think that is probably true. I find I'm always drawn north.
I was going to say, but could that just be he's drawn west because the woods happen to be west of where he lives?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, the way that my neighborhood is situated, I'm at the very south end, and I tend to want to walk up through the greenery and everything like that rather than down towards like more urban areas, also going through college campus housing. That's not as appealing to me. So yeah, maybe it is just this nature thing is over here, or for me it's north. But yeah, I don't see any particular reason why humans always go west. I think that was probably just a product of thinking of his time, and just like the story that they told about the course of human history. But
right. Well, and in their kind of current, in their way of thinking about things, the West did have an association with the new, because it was like America is this like wild, like quote, uncharted territory. I mean, obviously it had people, but it was, and then, the Wild West was seen as this uncharted land. So I think there was this, he probably was biased that there was this natural association in his day with just like the West being new. 'Cause he talks about how going west is into the future, and then going east is a return to the past, which I guess would just be a return to Europe and all of its culture and history. Yeah.
It was interesting reading some of those passages in Thoreau, because there was definitely a kind of mix of like manifest destiny and, colonialism stuff. And then he says, when I say we're going west, I really mean going to the wild, which I do think is true, but I think he is, we'll say, I don't know. I think that there's a bit of jingoism going on as well.
Yeah, he might be romanticizing it a little bit. So
in this part,
I also wanted to maybe touch on, he talks about how in a lot of Western literature.
Really quick, can I hop on something?
Oh yeah.
He says, to Americans, I hardly need to say, westward the star of empire takes its way. So I don't know. I'm happy to read authors and say, okay, like I'll follow you this far, this other stuff, it's
right.
It's not important for me to be 100% on board with everything that I read from every person.
Totally. Yeah. It's an interesting idea, but maybe doesn't quite hold up. But yeah, I was curious what you thought about his analysis of like Western literature, because he seems to think that a lot of poets and Western literature, and even including like Shakespeare, is lacking this kind of primal sense of nature, and he sees mythology as being like the really like the closest thing to it. And I can maybe read this quote. He says, I demand something which no Augustan nor Elizabethan age, which no culture, in short, can give. Mythology comes nearer to it than anything. How much more fertile a nature, at least, has Grecian mythology its root in than English literature? Mythology is the crop which the old world bore before its soil was exhausted, before the fancy and imagination were affected with blight, in which it still bears, whether its pristine vigor is unabated. All other literatures endure only as the elms which overshadow our houses, but this is like the great dragon tree of the Western Isles. Yeah.
So I think Thoreau is right. And I think that there are a couple ways in which I agree with his analysis. One, mythology is more primal than I would say, probably all literature that we read. And I think the reason for that is because, in part, we write what we know. And so as society becomes, as it develops, like there is just like, especially if you compare once industrialization occurs, the world which more and more people start to operate in is more structured. Myths, I don't think, there's some structure to them, but it's not, they're considerably shorter usually. And there's also, I think, a bit of randomness, a bit of like trying to make sense of natural things going on, which isn't often the case with like society novels or Jane Austen or Stephen King or Dostoevsky. So part of it is, I think, people who were communicating, not necessarily even writing back then, because a lot of these myths come, before. But yeah, the kind of world that they were connected to was more infused with nature, and it wasn't as structured, private property, parceled out. But I think the other reason is because writing itself is a structured act. And so when you're writing a book or you're creating a plot, to thread meaning through like an entire story, which is like saying there's all these events going on and we have to like find a through line that connects them in a way that makes sense. That, I think, is a very human enterprise, and that is not what nature is about. I don't think nature is trying to create a singular story or something. When you walk into the woods, there's a feeling there, but there's not a narrative thread. And I think when we're writing fiction or essays or whatever, we've already taken the whole of the experience and put it through a kind of like squeezing tube so that everything kind of comes out through this central focal point of like a singular story or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think about it similarly. I think about it in terms of like kind of rationality and irrationality, or something that came up for me was the way Nietzsche, because Nietzsche kind of talks about the same thing, because Nietzsche kind of critiques a lot of Western literature, and he says basically the Greeks and Socrates like ruined it, like because there tended to be this overemphasis on rationality that kind of came with Socrates and some of the Greeks, where, and that would be the way he categorizes is Apollonian and Dionysian.
Sure.
And Apollo is, kind of represents rationality and order and structure, and Dionysus represents chaos and passion, and I guess in this case, nature. So he sees the West as, kind of starting with the Greeks. In his view, we kind of de-emphasized the irrational and emphasized the rational to the point where, he sees it being a problem because, we kind of, in his view, need to have both of those things. And when you take out the irrational and take out the wild, maybe you get a certain kind of staleness, which is kind of similar to maybe what Thoreau is trying to get at here. And that he says, I don't have the quote on hand, but he says something like, anytime there is something like exciting, basically, that is the wild. And I think that the wild is, if we wanted to use Nietzsche's terms, we could say Dionysian, that's that kind of irrational, wild side that is maybe missing a little bit now from Western culture, because we tend to value rationality and science and all of these things so much more. And that could be why he sees mythology as being so rich, because a lot of mythology, it is irrational, right? You mean, you have people swallowing planets, and like you have a lot of things that doesn't make any sense to the rational brain, but maybe speaks to our irrational nature. And so it is an interesting thing. I also like how he conceptualizes it in terms of seeing, Thoreau's really great at painting these like metaphors in his ideas. So I liked kind of thinking about mythology as this big, what kind of tree does he? Dragon tree. One of these huge trees that is, bore all of this fruit. And he also says he kind of ponders whether or not the current American mythology will like spring all of this art in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think America, well, I don't know. That's like a question that you could like spin out some kind of response, but who can really say? But I think it's interesting because, to talk about the literature a little bit more.
Yeah.
When we find a story satisfying, like we don't find when a 4-year-old tells you a story about their day, most of us don't find that intrinsically satisfying because there's no resolution. Like this thing that happens earlier doesn't circle back. The random event that you're like, this is just made up. This doesn't make any sense. And I think that is more in tune with how we interact with nature. Because if you think about a child's perspective, right, they're in a world for the first time. They're trying to make sense of everything that's going on around them. They haven't quite figured out, this is the key that, unlocks and orders everything. And I think when we're in the natural world, we're in a somewhat similar state. Things don't seem to make sense as much because, our minds play tricks on us much more easily than if we're just, at a Starbucks or something, because there's no pattern to how we should process that experience. Unless you go out to the same thing every single time and you know what you're going to expect, then it becomes like a very familiar area. But I think the unfamiliarity of nature, both when you go to a new place, but also its intrinsic disorder, makes the experience more chaotic. And perhaps myth comes out of that background of being in a society where you still haven't unlocked everything. There's still a lot of unknowns going on. Why is there thunder or lightning? And we're actually, we succumb to the forces of nature much more frequently. And so I think that's where some of the power of myth comes from, is this trying to wrestle with the unknown and being unable to process it. So you kind of come up with a story that ultimately sort of answers it, but kind of leaves it open as well.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And this might be kind of a clunky transition, but well, one of the things you were talking about was kind of like the known and the unknown. All right, so this is a clunky transition, but I don't care. I'm going with it anyways because I really wanted to get to this idea.
It's your podcast,
right? And Thoreau would probably be disappointed that I'm forcing an agenda here, but I tried to make it happen naturally. It doesn't always work. But one of the ideas I loved was he talks a bit about education here and how kind of we educate children. And he talks about ignorance. And I want to read this quote here. He says, "A man's ignorance sometimes is not only useful, but beautiful. while his knowledge, so-called, is oftentimes worse than useless, besides being ugly. And then he says, which is the best man to deal with? He who knows nothing about a subject and, what is extremely rare, knows that he knows nothing, or he who really knows something about it but thinks that he knows all.
Mm-hmm.
So he seems to be talking here about, there's this problem that a lot of people have, which is we think we already know it. We think we already know everything, and that prevents us from actually learning or actually seeing things as they are. And that, as he says, ignorance is sometimes not only useful but beautiful, because if you're ignorant and you know that you're ignorant, you're at least your vision is not clouded by the idea that you already know the answers.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I kind of attach this idea to like beginner's mind, which is a big idea in like Zen Buddhism. Mm-hmm. And that, there's the quote that like in the beginner's mind, there are several possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there is only one.
Mm-hmm.
And that like, if we already think that we know everything, that is just going to hinder us from learning anymore, or from seeing things the way that they actually are. So I really loved how he put this. But yeah, I don't know. Did you have any thoughts on this idea?
Yeah, well, I don't want to claim to really know my thoughts about this. No, I'm just kidding. I think that this is very similar to my own feelings about epistemology. I don't think that we really know much of anything. I'm pretty skeptical about the unlimited direction or power of human knowledge. I think that when we, generally speaking, when we approach the world, we're really like a lump of flesh with a brain, and it has like these 5 inputs, and then it's got the brain to process through it. And it just seems unlikely that we're going to actually understand all that there is to know about the world through only 5 means. I mean, actually, we have more than 5 senses, but whatever. The number is not important.
Yeah.
There's just likely a lot of things going on that we're not privy to. And so for me, I am generally skeptical about certainty and knowledge. And if we look through history, of course, we can see, like these people, I can't believe they really thought that. That makes no sense. But we really know what's going on.
Right. Like kind of what we were doing with Thoreau's hypothesis about the westward pole. It's a similar kind of thing.
Yeah. So I think the jury is out on whether or not human knowledge is actually as sensible as it seems to be. But I think the more important thing, well, in some sense it doesn't matter, because from like a pragmatist point of view, like what is true is what works. And so if you know, like, it doesn't matter if you know how your car works exactly, so long as you understand, okay, I got to turn the key, I got to like move this into drive, then I'm off on the road. I think most of our knowledge will not have an impact, like it's not going to change radically and have a huge impact on many of the things that we do socially or day to day. But I think that the way that we position ourselves in regard to others or in regard to the world, of knowing that you probably don't know what's right or what's true, I think that is actually much more important as an internal compass than is the opposite of being confident about that you know particularly this kind of thing. So I think, ultimately the import is about us and how we then go about living, rather than, whether or not we actually have, 95% of our knowledge is right or wrong or whatever.
Right. Yeah, and I agree. I think what he's talking about here is not so much whether or not we can attain knowledge or whether or not there is objective truth. It's kind of, again, like an orientation. Like the orientation is, yeah, maybe I know some things, maybe I don't, but I'm going to kind of go into the world with an empty vessel and, have this beginner's mind so that I don't show up already thinking that I know all the answers and I, can't nobody tell me nothing, Kanye West. I think that's kind of what he's getting at, which I love. And I think it reminded me of, there's a great book called How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler. And he says something like, the science teacher likes when his students have prior knowledge about science, but the philosophy teacher hates when his students have prior knowledge about philosophy. And I think he's getting to that same thing, because if you have a philosophy student, at least in his estimation, like, you start maybe talking about ideas or philosophies and they already know everything. It's like, you can't, I already know it all. And, can't tell me nothing. So
religion students too. I feel like that's even worse.
I would imagine. Yeah. Whereas it is interesting because at least in that estimation, he says, like, for science, it's actually a good thing, because with the science student, you can start, you can kind of build on their previous knowledge. Whereas he says with philosophy students, it can get in the way. But it sort of is about what the goal in the classroom is, right? Because ultimately, that's probably not a good way to think about science either, I imagine. If you're already, the whole point of a hypothesis is the uncertainty. And then when you prove something in science, you are supposed to know that it is right until it is proven wrong. And so there's this, what is the word for humility? Humble stance that a scientist ought to take. That's kind of like built into the approach. But I think a lot of times that ends up not happening, right? And this is, for some reason, I think that this is what happened to the guy who thought about Teutonic plates. Okay. And he had like all this research and everyone was like, no, this is totally ridiculous. Because people were kind of convinced that what had come before was actually true. Totally. Well, and there's a phenomenon, I think it's called Einstellung, which is kind of what this is all about. And this is the kind of phenomenon where a lot of breakthroughs in different fields, they come from somebody who is not in the field. And the thinking is that the people that are already in the field, they can only see it one way just because they're so kind of indoctrinated in it. And the person who's outside of the field doesn't have that lens to see everything, and they're kind of going into it with fresh eyes, and they're just like, oh, have you guys ever thought about doing it this way? And they are able to kind of come in with that beginner's mind and just like revolutionize like an entire field or industry.
And I wonder, so one thing that Thoreau talks about a little bit is when he's talking about how he decides where to walk. And he says that he feels like there's this internal compass pull, and that sometimes he actually has to stand there for like 20 or 30 minutes or something, just like going back and forth, like, which way do I really want to go inside? And then fine, I'll just go this way, whatever. I guess we'll do the same thing, damn it. And I think that that's interesting, because I think the practice of having an open mind is somewhat similar. Like there really is a lot of wrestling daily in that, and this is not coming from a person who has a, universally open mind. I certainly don't wrestle with myself back and forth all the time about every single thing that I have a conviction over. But I think ultimately in the way that he describes that there's a pull, a sort of magnetism.
Yeah.
For him personally, there likely is a kind of intuition that we all have about quite a number of things, but we often bury it by habit.
Totally. Well, and I was thinking about, so the pull can be something at the micro level where it's like, am I feeling pulled to walk this way on my walk or that way on my walk? But the pull can also be happening on a macro level where it's like, am I being pulled towards this career or this career? And I know that's something that Emerson talks a lot about, and Thoreau was, influenced by him a lot. That kind of like really, really dialing in and listening to your inner compass. So yeah, it is interesting that it can be used on the kind of micro level when it's just like, which way do I want to go on my walk?
Yeah.
Cause yeah, I think usually when we think about like listening to our intuition, at least for me personally, I think my bias is to think about it on like macro global things of like, is my heart telling me to like marry this person? Is my heart telling me to like choose this career path? But it could just be, am I thinking about going left at the bend or right on the bend?
Yeah, I'm totally micro. I don't care about these big things. I'm like, go away. I don't want to hear about what my internal voice has to say. But if I'm like opening a pack of gum, I really take a second to think, okay, which piece am I really being drawn to here?
Wow.
It's always on the right. This is true. This is totally true. It's always like the rightmost piece.
Wow. So you have an eastward pull then.
Well, it depends on which way I'm facing, I guess.
I guess it's true. That's funny. Well, I think what's so cool about this piece, or what I really liked about it, is there are a lot of meta things happening. Because like walking is this metaphor for life. And, the orientation that somebody can take in a 15-minute walk is the same orientation that somebody can take with their life, where it's just like a different approach to living. And yeah, the same thing where it's like the same kind of deliberateness you can have with kind of listening to your inner voice when it comes to, the macro. It can also transition to the micro and vice versa. Yeah.
I think one thing that really interested me was, totally didn't mean to.
No, I was done. I didn't have any more. Please.
So one of the last things that he talks about is our obeying the law. And he doesn't really mean, legally. Well, he does mean that, but that's not the main pull of it. He says, and this is actually right after what you were talking about with the knowledge thing. There's something servile in the habit of seeking after a law which we may obey. We may study the laws of matter at and for our convenience, but a successful life knows no law. It is an unfortunate discovery, certainly, that of a law which binds us where we did not know before that we were bound. Live free, child of the mist, and with respect to knowledge, we are all children of the mist. The man who takes the liberty to live is superior to all the laws by virtue of his relation to the lawmaker. And I think that, this is maybe like the thrust of a lot of what he's saying in the essay. Like if I was going to boil it down, I think it is kind of about this. And I think walking is a metaphor, kind of what you were saying, about how we live in relationship to the law of society or the law of habit or the law of the voices that are around us telling us that this is, how you should approach life. And he says, get away from all that. Go into the bog, go into the swamp, walk around a bit, get lost, see things from a new way. Eventually maybe come back home, but then go out again, And I think that that's true because we can find ways of doing that in every area of our life, where we have this, we think that there's a certain way things should go, and then eventually, through experience or just age, or intentionally undoing those assumptions, we realize, oh, this isn't really what it's like at all.
Thanks for listening to Unpacking Ideas. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with a friend or scroll down and write a review or give us a 5-star rating. All that helps tremendously, so thanks so much in advance. If you'd like to read along with us, please visit unpackingideas.com, where I post links to the future pieces that we'll be discussing on future podcast episodes. And finally, if this conversation inspired you to want to get out in nature and go for a walk or go for a hike, definitely check out Stephen's free backpacking resource called backpackmap.com. And there you can find information about where different trails are located across the country, as well as all of the logistical information that you need in order to plan your next hike. So definitely check that out. And that is it. I will see you guys next episode.